Hey, welcome back to another episode of Optica, where we invite you to open your eyes and see what God is doing. And I want to thank you for connecting week after week, especially in this series about narcissism and church cultures that foster narcissism. Many of you have engaged, you've written texts, you've written messages, you've commented either on our podcast or our YouTube page. And we just want to say thank you for listening. And also thanks for the recommendations and some of the questions that have come in. Among those questions, one of the top questions is, why do people allow narcissistic abuse? And that's a question I want to get to today, perhaps framing it a different way. Instead of why do people allow it, is who is vulnerable to narcissistic abuse? Who are the vulnerable people, or what are the vulnerable characteristics to narcissistic abuse? And so obviously in this episode, we're not going to create an exhaustive list, but I want to just enumerate a few in your listening, see what you think, ponder it, reflect on it, and of course, always get back to us here on Optica. And the first thing I want to talk about is empathy. Undiscerning, empathetic people. Judith Orloff, she's a psychiatrist. She talks about undiscerning empaths, or people who have empathy without discernment. The tragedy is that empathy is a good thing. I want to say that again. Empathy is a good thing. However, narcissists, whether intentionally or unintentionally, abuse our empathy to get attention, to get accolades, and quite frankly, to sometimes get out of us things we don't want to give. And so what is an undiscerning empath? A person who has undiscerning empathy. It's a person who often thinks, oh, I can change this person if I just love them, if I just listen to them, if I just cater to them, if I'm open to their vulnerabilities. All the time, you're doing it with a good heart, with a good intention. The person who is abusing you doesn't realize they're taking advantage of your empathy. And so, while empathy is a good thing, if we have empathy and we don't discern that it's being abused, that person is using our empathy to build their own platform, to build their own stage, to build their own influence, while discarding our emotions. And there's a danger of having empathy without discernment, is that sometimes we focus so much on the emotions and the needs of the other person that we ignore ours. That's undiscerning. We can value other people's emotions. We can listen to them. But if they're a narcissist, they're going to try to make us listen to them while ignoring our own empathies. Now, I want to underline this. When you're narcissistic, oftentimes you lack empathy. And so you surround yourself with men and women who are deeply empathetic to further your agenda, to fill voids in your heart, in your emotional life, all the while ignoring the needs, the emotions of other people. And so if you're empathetic, just raise a red flag, highlight that we can be vulnerable in our empathy to people who will abuse our kindness. Who's the second group of people who may be vulnerable to narcissistic abuse? This is a big one. People pleasers, or sometimes called approval seekers. Now look, we all need approval to some degree. We all need an attaboy or an attagirl. But if our sense of identity comes from approval, outside approval, and a narcissist becomes aware of that, they're either going to deny our approval or devalue our value in order to get something out of us. Seeking approval as the center of our identity and worth makes us vulnerable to narcissistic leaders. You might ask, but how does that happen? Well, here's how it happens. The leader knows that his or her approval gives you a sense of worth or a sense of accomplishment, and they'll either withhold it or give it as a reward or a punishment for you following them blindly or celebrating them. Did you hear that? Narcissistic leaders will either dole out or withhold approval from people who desperately need approval for a sense of worth and a sense of identity to get out of them what they need and to keep that person subservient or to keep that person with blind allegiance to that leader. And so if you wrestle, like many of us do, let's be honest, with seeking approval, we need to be aware that that makes us vulnerable to narcissistic leaders who will either withhold approval or dole out approval in order to make us compliant. The third thing, and this one's a big one, and I have to be honest, I often have wrestled with this in my own life. People who have difficulty setting boundaries. If you're like me, the word no is a difficult word because you want to be helpful. You want to come alongside people. Who doesn't like to be helpful? Who doesn't like to come alongside people, especially people who are in vocations that help people, nurses, doctors, pastors, psychiatrists, teachers, counselors. And oftentimes in our seeking to help people and to be there for people, we don't set boundaries. And oh my goodness, will a narcissist trample all over you if you don't have the capacity to set boundaries. Well, you tell someone, hey, I'm here to serve you, but there are limits to this. There are boundaries to this. You know, I was thinking about this the other day. I was talking to my wife and I was talking to some friends of mine. We don't teach people to set boundaries. In the culture where I grew up, and in case you didn't know it, I'm Latino. In the culture we grew up, we celebrate service and we celebrate coming alongside people, and we should, because service and humility are a good thing. But there are people who will take advantage of our service orientation and our posture of humility to capitalize for their own selfish ambition and selfish gain. And so, because in many of our cultures, especially Christian culture, let me underline this here. Jesus taught us, rightfully so, that we ought to serve, that we ought to be humble. But even Jesus put boundaries on people. When Peter asked him something that he was not willing to do or called to do, he told Peter, no, we're not doing that, Peter. When the Pharisees made demands on people that were against the deepest values of the gospel, Jesus confronted them. And so one of the difficult tasks in cultures that celebrate service and humility is teaching people to simultaneously set healthy boundaries. It's what Pete Scazzaro and others call the gift of limits. And here's what a narcissist will do. They'll keep asking and asking and asking till you or I decide to say, no, that's all I can give no more. Because while the narcissist is extracting from you, he or she is not investing in you. That's how you know that your boundaries are being violated or your boundaries are being transgressed, because there's asking and asking and asking, but no giving and no investment. I want to really speak to you because this has been a line of abuse in many of our churches, in many of our not-for-profit organizations, where we say, well, it's your honor to serve. You get to serve. That's true. We all get to serve. That includes the leader who's asking. He or she also has to serve. And the gift of boundaries tells people, hey, I'm not the only one serving. This is a team effort, and it empowers other people. The narcissist will often abuse people who have difficulty setting boundaries, people who are seeking approval, people who are empathetic without discernment. Here's another thing that's important. And you might not think that people who are powerful and ambitious are susceptible to narcissistic abuse, but they are. Number 4, ambitious people can be susceptible to narcissism. Now, how is that? How is it that ambitious people and driven people can be susceptible to narcissism? Because narcissists play on our ambition, on our desire to get ahead. And they know that if they're in a place of leadership, they know that if they are in a place of leadership where our promotion, our influence doors opening for us is dependent on that narcissistic leader, they'll play on our ambition. And they'll say, your promotion depends on me. Your influence depends on me. And because you are so ambitious to get ahead, you will be compliant with even the most extreme demands of that leader or of that culture. Listen, lean into this. Never let your ambition lead you down the road where you say yes to things that violate your ethics. Never let your ambition lead you down the road where you say yes to things that violate your ethics. There's nothing wrong with wanting to improve your life. There's nothing wrong with wanting to make a contribution. But selfish ambition can open the door to us being abused by narcissistic leaders. Here's another thing I want to add. People who have no core or no conviction. Before you enter a place or an organization, before you sign a contract, before you say yes to a ministry, before you join a group, all that inner work of what are your deepest convictions, what is your core as a person needs to be resolved. You need to say, hey, there are things I will not violate, even if it costs me joining this group, or even if it costs me getting someone's favor or someone's approval. If we do not develop an inner core or an inner conviction, we are susceptible to narcissistic abuse. Put another way, inner core or inner conviction is, do you have a moral compass? Do you have a moral compass? Or are you so easily swayed by what everybody's saying yes to, by peer pressure, by influence, by followers, that there are things you won't say no to or things you won't say yes to? So it's important to do that deep reflection of what is my core conviction and what is my moral compass. This last one I want to highlight is probably the one most often seen. People with unresolved trauma. People with unresolved trauma. And many people have trauma, and there are levels to trauma that we can't get into today on this short episode. But oftentimes, narcissistic leaders can identify people who have trauma that is unresolved. And you know what they do? They come alongside them as their healer, as their hero, as their champion. Did you hear that? They'll come alongside the person who has unresolved trauma as their healer, as their champion, as their advocate, with the goal in mind to use that person as a sycophant. You know why? Because people with unresolved trauma who see a champion in another person can often feel indebted to that person. And the narcissistic leader knows that that person with unresolved trauma feels indebted, and they use that sense of indebtedness to keep them compliant and subservient. Listen closely. And this is important for pastors and leaders. If you do a favor for somebody, if you help a marriage, if you help a business partner, never hold that over their head. People should not be indebted to anyone forever. Our only Savior is Jesus Christ. And if you belong to a culture, to an organization where the leader did something for you, for your marriage, for your family, and is always dangling it over your head, it could be that you are in a narcissistic, toxic culture where people only help you for what they can get out of you. My goodness, that's not the gospel. It's important that we help people, but we help them not transactionally. Not, hey, I'm going to help you in your marriage so you can do something for me. Hey, I'm going to help your kid who's struggling with this or that or the other thing so that you can return the investment. Whether people return the investment or not, the gospel calls us to help people. because they're loved by God, not because they're some object of some goal of fame or building a platform or building an institution. Of course, we should feel grateful, but gratitude and indebtedness are not the same thing. I think I may say that again because I kind of like that. That spoke to me. Gratitude and indebtedness are not the same thing. I'm a pastor. I've helped a lot of people, and they've said thank you, and I say you're welcome. And I've been helped by a lot of people. I've had counselors that have helped me. I've had mentors that have helped me. But here is the narcissistic culture. It goes something like this in español. No te olvides que yo te ayudé. Don't forget that I helped you. They're always reminding you of the favors they did for you. And a traumatized person or a person with unresolved trauma will feel internally indebted, which is not the same thing as eternally grateful. And so, if you are wrestling with a culture that's narcissistic and you have some of these unresolved issues of needing constant approval, of not having a moral compass, of being empathetic but not discerning, of having the challenge of setting boundaries, or of having unresolved trauma, I invite us. Let's do the deep work. Let's reflect on those tendencies and characteristics or practices in our lives that open the door to narcissistic abuse. Finally, let me say this. There are cultures that feed off this. We need to be aware of those vulnerable people in our churches and in our communities and in our organizations. And we need to be aware when leadership, middle management, when any level of leadership is preying on these vulnerabilities. We need to do 360-degree reflections on the practices of our organizations and our institutions so that we do not continue to nourish narcissistic practices that either reinforce these tendencies that make us vulnerable or reinforce narcissistic leaders that prey on the vulnerable. As always, we're asking you to pray about this, reflect about this, and write us. Send us a message. This is Pastor Gabe inviting you once again to open your eyes and see what God is doing.